From a warehouse job with too much baggage to be worth it, to a haunted basement in a small shop, and even a haunted house in the middle of nowhere. Today's video will be a mix of the unexplainable and the paranormal. If the paranormal is explainable in the first place, that is. Today's video will be featuring 3 terrifying stories. As always, a huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share these stories with you. Their links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. A standard day on the job goes downhill when one finds themselves lost when they, by all means, shouldn't be. Going about their duties mindlessly, they are snapped back to reality when they realize that they don't know where they are anymore. This is my story of how a similar event spiraled into something that I will never be able to forget. The day started just like any other. I woke up, took a shower, got dressed, and ate some breakfast. Pinning my name tag that read Jerome to my uniform, I tried to rub the tiredness out of my eyes as I went out the door. My name, for the record, is not Jerome, it's Jeremy. No amount of telling those people at the office seemed to change that. I should explain that the job I do isn't anything exciting. Far from it, actually. I work in a warehouse, helping put stock away and unloading the trucks that come in. It's a job so mind-numbing after the first couple of months. You either learn to go on autopilot, or you ask to be switched to one of the more thought-provoking departments. Some days I can compare it to being forced to watch paint dry. It's not that the job is hard, it's just dreadfully boring. I mention all of this to explain how it all started. You see, we use small phone-like scanners to do the job. It would bring up the next item that needed to be picked, with the amount and location of the item within the warehouse. At this point in the job, I had worked there nearly a year, so I knew the warehouse like the back of my hand, which made autopilot mode so natural to me. It was about halfway through the day. I was in the warehouse on my usual autopilot routine, mindlessly following the items I had to take off the shelves and put away elsewhere. The next item that popped up after I tapped the screen was farther away than I was expecting, but not too unusual at the time. Occasionally you'd get the odd item or two that was located halfway across the warehouse, at the end of a list, so it didn't register as strange yet. Going towards the designated location, I eventually found the shelf I was looking for, snatching the unmarked jar off the shelf. This was about the time I realized that where I was shouldn't have been possible. At least not to memory. I was at the shelf marked 101, with all the other shelves having a similar numbered system to them. Staring at the white jar, however, I realized that the hundreds should have ended at around 105. My autopilot was fully broken finally, and I began to look around. The shelf that I had taken the jar off of was mostly empty, only a couple of the same unmarked jars left on it. A thin layer of dust came off it as I dragged a finger across its surface. This shelf in particular marked the end of one of the mini warehouse hallways, almost like a sort of dead end in a labyrinth. The light above it flickered, a pale blue glow coming from it instead of the regular yellow that was everywhere else. Its placement and oddities were peculiar, sure, but when I looked back I could see the rest of the warehouse that I did recognize. I shook my head finally, scolding myself for even getting confused by this. It must have just been a shelf I never had to pick from before, and didn't notice until now. With the blank jar in hand, I made my way back out of the hallway and went back to work, feeling a nice current of warm air as I left the dead end. That moment was forgotten about almost as soon as it happened. The rest of the day was uneventful, the norm of the job. I went home, had some dinner, and spent the rest of the night gaming until finally passing out. The next day was more of the same for me, and I can't really say if anything unusual happened again for at least another couple of weeks. It was a closing shift this time, Friday night just before one of my weekends too. It's hard to keep on autopilot during times like this, because I get a bit impatient waiting for the clock to tick down. But the benefit of a closing shift is near the end, you get to listen to your own music. That helps block out that dreadful drone of the radio that never changes its playlist, and makes time move along a bit quicker. Towards the end of my shift it happened again. This time being so out of it I didn't really realize what had happened until I went to leave. Another item came up that was far away. I mindlessly walked up to the spot and grabbed the item. When I did go to leave, however, it was about 2 minutes of walking before I realized I was lost. This fact seemed impossible to me at first. Looking at the labeled number on the closest shelf to try and reorient myself, the number that was listed wasn't even recognizable to me, at least not in English. A few characters were printed down, but they were completely foreign. Looking away from the label, I realized that all the shelves around me were lit up with that same eerie blue glow I recognized from a week or so ago, bulbs above keeping steady this time. All of the shelves had the same thin layer of dust on them, and if I focused I could tell that the temperature had dropped by at least a few degrees. The first thing I did after that was pinch my arm, the pain shooting through me and confirming to some degree that I was probably not dreaming. My mind rolled over explanations to what was currently happening as I walked slowly down the corridors of shelves and attempted to find a label that I actually could read. Had I wandered into an unused part of the warehouse by mistake? The warehouse was big, sure, but I had never been told of any other areas that weren't used, and where I was seemed way too big to be somewhere that I wouldn't have noticed. From all the walking I had done, at least this place had to be quite large. More troubling than that, though, was a creeping fog that seemed to have come out of nowhere. A white wall boxing me in from all sides, and limiting my vision down to just 6 or so feet in front of me. Ultimately, I decided that either I was dreaming, or I'd gone completely nuts. Regardless of whatever situation I was dealing with, I was at least conscious enough to realize it, and nothing horrible had happened. With little else to do, I started to inspect the rows of shelves I came across farther. Whenever there was a sort of jar or container on it, I always stopped to inspect it. They were all pure white on the outside, and had a sort of dried paint feel to them. Around the top where a lid would normally be, was instead just a slight dent all around, marking where a lid should be, but not actually being a lid. Trust me, I tried. No matter how hard I twisted the top of any of those things, I couldn't pry off the top. I was half tempted to try and stab the things open with my box cutter, but didn't want to ruin the blade. Half an hour of walking later, and there was some sort of notable change to the place. The shelves became less dusty for one thing. There were also more and more containers the deeper I got into the place. Still no luck in telling what was in them, of course, but a change was a sign. Good or bad being hard to tell at the moment. The entire time I did walk, I also never heard any sounds other than my own, and the occasional electrical crackle of a light flickering. It was eerie, but in its own way kind of peaceful. I had stopped to rest my legs a bit, propping my back against one of the shelves, when that silence was broken. In the distance somewhere, obscured by fog, was a new sound. A metal clang followed by a sort of high-pitched whine made its way through the fog to me, muffled but audible. I don't know whether I felt excited or worried about this. If it was a dream, I had nothing to fear. If I had gone loopy, I really didn't know what was the best way to deal with it. And if the third option was that all of this was really happening, I don't want to think on that too much. What I did know is I needed a way out of here, and I was already starting to freak out internally the longer I stayed. Slowly I rose to my feet, and stared off in the direction of the noise. The noise seemed to repeat itself pretty consistently, which made following it easier. I was so affixed to following this noise, however, I don't think I realized what was on the shelves started to change again. It wasn't until the noise paused, and I assessed my new location, that I stumbled back into one of the shelves, with a loud bang. as my eyes caught sight of what was resting on the shelf on the other side of me. A long white bone rested on it, alongside a few more jars and other similar bones. The warehouse wasn't a butcher shop, so seeing something that looked so real back here nearly set me off into full panic mode. That wasn't until one of the jars above me on the shelf I had fallen into crashed on the top of my head. My vision went dark, and the sound of shattering glass rung in my ears as I fell flat on my ass. When my vision finally returned, I found myself surrounded by worried coworkers. My head snapped around looking at where I was. It looked like I was back in the normal warehouse. After a bit of calming down by my coworkers, they said that they had heard a crash and had found me lying on the ground next to the smashed jar. Luckily, I wasn't bleeding, and it seemed short of one hell of a headache, I was fine physically. I didn't tell them about what I had seen, only thankful at the moment for being brought back to the normal world. I did, however, take an impromptu vacation, one which my boss was happy to grant, seeing as I got injured in their store. Funny how much they want to help, if it means you won't be trying to get them in trouble, that is. During the week I spent away from work, I tried my best to repress what had happened, playing a mind-numbing amount of video games and catching up with friends, with the only logical explanation still being that I had either fallen asleep or hallucinated what I had seen. I wasn't looking forward to returning to work. Unfortunately, rent wouldn't pay itself. If another incident occurred, I would just have to book an appointment with a psychologist and get it sorted. I'll admit, I was much more confident externally than I was internally about this. In general, things like horror movies or ghost stories never scared me. That part of my brain always seemed to recognize that there was no way it could be real, so I wasn't in any actual danger. When I thought back to my time wandering those foggy shelved halls, though, I didn't have that same reaction to it. At least not as much as I normally would have. It just felt too real at the time. The drive to work was not an enjoyable one, and all through the day I felt like I was walking on eggshells the entire time, just waiting to turn around and find myself lost again in those dusty shelves. However, nothing happened, nor did anything happen the day after that, or the day after that one. Weeks passed by and the strange event would eventually slip from my mind, as I decided that it had just been one hell of a messed up dream and I left it at that. This was my first mistake. When the automation set in again, and my old habits returned, it wasn't long before it happened once more. I think it was about a month after the incident. I was no longer really keeping track of time, and was back into my rut of working. I actually was working an opening shift this time, something that usually put me wide awake, but after a late night of gaming, I was anything but that. No, I wasn't wide awake until I felt that familiar chill of air run down my neck again, and registered that the lights had shifted to a familiar eerie blue glow. I found myself back at the same spot I had left off, or at least perhaps just as far in. To my left there was the same assortment of random white jars I was used to seeing, but with the addition of a few white bones stacked neatly on top of one another. When I got over the shock, I realized that it wasn't as though the bones I saw on the shelf or other shelves nearby were thrown onto them carelessly. They had been stacked precisely and aligned neatly, just like their regular products were. It was a realization that didn't really lend itself with much of an explanation as to what it could mean, but it did give me a very different feeling about the place than I once had. These thoughts were interrupted when from the looming white fog close by came a wet crunching noise followed by a sound of a metallic clang. It wasn't what I had heard before, it was something new. I felt as though my legs were about to buckle as I stood there shaking, eyes affixed to the direction of the sound as my mind desperately tried to think of a plan. Too terrified to call out or even speak at this point, I instead mustered up as much courage as I could and started my way slowly towards the direction of the sound. I had seen that there was no one else here on the outer areas, where the dust lined the shelves. There had been multiple dead ends around those areas too, so I felt like my only real option was to find out what, or who was making that noise. After all, if this was just some kind of dream, I had nothing to fear, right? This was the thought that propelled me forward one step at a time. The closer I got, the more shelves began to fill with bones and jars, becoming immaculate in their condition as well. The noise itself wasn't the same every time. A different kind of crunch or slicing noise followed by the clang. At this point, it sounded like it was only yards away from me. And that was proven true when I finally reached what you could call the end of the shelves. I saw the outline of a large square opening ahead, and stopped to try and approach it a bit more carefully. Ducking under a couple of shelves, I walked around the outskirts of this open square, until I finally found one of the sides of it, where I could get a closer look from the other side of a shelf instead of a hallway. I brought my face up to the opening in between the shelves, finally closing that few meter gap, so I could at least see into the room ahead without having to actually be in it, when my breath caught in my throat. In the center of the room was what looked to be a raised platform of sorts, rectangular shape jutting out of the floor at about waist height. Standing in front of it with its back turned to me was what I can only describe as a malformed being. Its skin was a pale, almost translucent white, being entirely naked from what I could see. Its arms seemed to sit too low on its body, shoulder blades almost kind of shoved downwards. The torso of it was much longer than it should have been, ending in a pair of legs that had reversed knees, and a head at the top that was bald with thinly stretched skin across it. The creature bobbed up and down gently, as its hands moved unseen in front of it for a moment, until I watched a cleaver raise up, only to be brought down hard onto a platform. It was at this point I saw what exactly the creature was working on. A body. Dead eyes peered back at me from the platform, as thin lines of blood leaked down onto the floor below. At least I thought they were dead. Help. The word escaped their lips in a wispy tone, causing me to release the breath I had been holding in. At the sound of the noise, the creature turned to face me, a massive clawed hand pressing into the ground, as a blank face was revealed. It had no eyes, nose, or even ears, almost looking as though someone had just stretched a sheet of white plastic across a human skull. What it did have, however, was a massive mouth that I watched unhinge before letting out a high-pitched shriek that rung out through the foggy halls of the warehouse. My feet had started to move before my mind even caught up to what was happening. Like a bullet, I rocketed down the hallways, hearing the sound of crashing metal and heavy thudding footsteps close behind me, while the thing forced its way into the hallways. Even though I was running as fast as I could tell that it was gaining on me, and I wouldn't be able to keep ahead of it much longer. Trying to act fast, I slowed my pace just enough to grab one of the white jars off of a nearby shelf in one hand, and readied my box cutter in the other. Just when it sounded like it was going to reach me out of the fog, I skidded to a halt, and with a turn hurled the jar behind me. I watched it sail through the air and crash directly into the face of the creature as it emerged out of the fog, cleaver in hand. The jar smashed into its mouth, and the glass shattered, ripping into its pale white skin. It was at that point I learned what was in those jars. A partially decayed head falling to the floor alongside a couple of fingers. A milky white liquid began to mix with the red blood that dripped from the creature's face. Its shrill shriek pierced my ears as it flailed its arms from side to side in anger. It struck one of the shelves to the left of it hard enough to cause it to shift. Another crash of metal rung out as the shelf toppled onto the thing. While it scrambled to free itself from the weight, I tried my best to start moving away, and trying to think of a new plan. I didn't know what to do though. It was freakishly strong and fast. That jar didn't seem to do much other than piss it off. My mind searched frantically for an answer. I had gotten out of this place before. Twice, in fact. But how? I replayed the events over and over, hunkering down underneath a shelf nearby. The creature still angrily shrieked off in the distance, signaling I had a few moments left to spare. Each time I had gotten here had been when I wasn't paying attention, when my mind was blank. When I had gotten out of here, it had almost been in the same sort of circumstances. It's hard to think when you get knocked out, and the first time I wasn't really freaking out like I was now. It felt like one hell of a long shot, but when I heard the sound of thundering footsteps again, I clenched my eyes shut and tried to clear my mind. The footsteps got closer and closer second by second, as I desperately tried to calm myself, breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth. I blocked out the fast approaching noise, the chill in the air, all of my surroundings, except for the darkness of my eyelids. Just when it sounded as though it was about to reach me, I could feel it shift again. The cool air was replaced by a warm gust across my body, finally causing me to open my eyes again and take in my surroundings after a few moments. I was back in the normal warehouse. Down the aisles I spotted a coworker and practically sprinted to their side. They asked if I was feeling okay, seeing as my clothes were drenched in sweat, and I was as pale as a ghost. Without a second thought, I left that warehouse, only calling my boss to tell him I quit after I was at home again. I still can't fully explain what I experienced. I tried doing some research online but didn't come up with much, until I started asking questions on forums. Asking around anonymously on message boards was followed by the occasional similar experience that was shared back to me, though in different locations. All of them mentioned details that I myself hadn't shared publicly, but lined up with my own experience, that being the transition that had occurred and what they had been doing at the time. There's one last thing that still worries me about all this. When I had come back to my world, there was a sensation I felt that I couldn't quite describe at the time, until I really thought about it. Even now, I still feel it to some degree. Occasionally, it will feel as though something is gently pressing against me, an invisible force that just barely registers, almost as though something is still trying to get to me from the other side, something that's still waiting for me to come back. Before I start, I just want to make something clear. This story is true. I'm not writing this to sound cool, as you might be able to tell. I literally just need to get this out there because I'm still freaking out. I work at a carpet shop in the south of England, and the shop is old. It was the old post office about 30 years ago, and it's all concrete and stone. Out the back of the shop are two staircases, one flight going up to the supply cupboards and tea room, where we make our drinks and have our lunch, and one flight going down to the basement. Each flight of stairs has 7 steps, then a small square where you turn yourself down another 7 steps. And as you can imagine, being in a carpet shop, the stairs get covered in fluff and debris from the carpets. So it's about 2 p.m., and I've just come back from my lunch break and my boss says, "Wash the front of the shop, mate. I'm going to sweep the staircases off." This was sweet because it's normally my job and I hate doing it. It makes your back ache, and while sweeping the bottom flight of stairs off, you have to back down them with your back facing the basement. At the bottom of the stairs are 2 massive clad iron doors, leading into 2 separate storerooms, which we don't use anymore, because the fluorescent light tubes blew down there, and we haven't replaced them. So as you can imagine, it's pitch black. I'm stood watching the cars by the rain thinking how cold my feet are when my boss calls me. "Do us a favor. I've done the top flight, but can you do the bottom flight for me? My back is killing me." "Yeah, no worries," I replied, as I walked towards the door passing my boss on the way. The brush was waiting for me on the banister, so I grabbed it and started my way down sweeping. First 7 steps is fine because your back is to the wall on landing, but I always get real anxious doing the bottom 7 steps. As I'm going down the bottom flight, my imagination starts to get the better of me, and I'm walking backwards down the basement imagining all kinds of creepy stuff standing behind me. Mostly stuff I've read on here, so thanks for that. I get 2 steps from the bottom and it happens. The most blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream I have ever heard rings out from inside one of the storerooms behind me. I'm talking like a woman who's pained, dying, breathing her last breath, in the loudest way possible kind of scream. Needless to say, I ran faster than I had ever run back up some stairs. In hindsight, I should have checked to see if anyone was actually in trouble down there, but the fight or flight kicked in and I fucking flew. I got to the door leading back onto the shop floor and was met by my boss. "What was that?" he said, confused. "I have no idea, but it came from the basement. I'm 100% sure of it." I should probably say members of the public can't get to the basement from the shop, and we have no female members of staff, so we're both confused and concerned. My boss braved it and went down to check who it was, and yep, you guessed it, absolutely no one down there. So yeah, I'm freaking out about working in the shop I've worked in for coming up on 4 years now. Anyone else experienced anything like this? I'm not completely opposed to the concept of ghosts and spirits and all of that stuff, but now I'm definitely considering the fact that that's what this is. If it was a ghost, then what on earth happened in this woman's last minutes for her to scream like that? And why is she still here? Back when I was a teen, I used to spend parts of my summer at my family's summer house in Skirrat, a beach town not far from Rabat, the capital of Morocco, where I lived. A few friends had summer houses there too, and we'd spend the days at the beach and the nights partying. So many unforgettable moments. But the most unforgettable of them all is the nights I spent in a haunted house. A little backstory first. There was this old abandoned house in a forest right outside of the town that had many urban legends surrounding it. We'd listen to fishermen and parking attendants, with who we'd smoke hash with, tell us stories to try and scare us. One I remember was of a guy who went exploring the house and saw among the dirty and broken rubble a perfectly white rabbit, which was clearly out of place. The rabbit started hopping away and the guy looked at it, following it with his eyes, one of which completely turned around and was stuck looking inside his skull. I've never really believed in these kinds of stories, having been agnostic or atheist, plus I don't think it was anatomically possible. One day I was hunting with a friend in the woods, and he had brought along his dog, a German Shepherd. We were tracking a flock of partridges when we passed near the house, and suddenly my friend's dog began running. We had to stop following the birds and started running after the dog, who we saw go into the house. Luckily for us, before we even entered it, we heard him barking on the other side of the house's wall, and didn't have to go in to get him. Ever since that incident, the dog wasn't normal. He had bloodshot red eyes, and was overly aggressive, even going as far as barking at his own owner, and trying to attack him, which was something he'd never done. My friend's family still kept him though, until the day where he got into a fight with his own brother. The other dog was found in the yard, his head decapitated from his body, and the other dog with his mouth full of blood. The family started to suspect something was really off, but chalked it up to rabies. Still, my friend's grandpa, probably knowing it was something more than that, or being too superstitious, decided to get rid of the dog. This brings us back to me, being skeptical of all this. I wanted to know for sure if the supernatural was real or not, and the only way to be sure was to go looking for proof myself. I asked a few friends if they wanted to try and spend the night in that supposedly haunted house. Obviously, most refused, but I managed to convince 4 of them. So the 5 of us decided to go there one night. We arrived near 11 p.m. at the house. It was run down, had broken windows, lots of graffiti, and overall had a creepy vibe. We entered through a windowless pane, and settled in a room that had 2 benches for some reason. There was anti-religious graffiti, like a crossed-out Star of David, inverted Christian crosses, etc. And we found traces of sahur, as well as torn pictures. We had brought a bottle of vodka and some hash, so we made ourselves comfortable. A few hours later, it was 3 a.m. All my friends were asleep and I needed to go to the bathroom. I already knew where it was, as it wasn't the first time I was going to go that night. They weren't far from the room we were in, and it was just a room with a broken toilet bowl and a sink, not even a mirror. As I made my way there, I heard the sound of hooves on the ground, as if a horse was walking around the house. I dismissed the sound as me being too high or too drunk, or both, and imagining things to trick myself into thinking the house was really haunted. As I arrived to the bathroom, I saw the light on inside, since there was an open space underneath the door. I was sure there was no electricity in the house. We were using our phone's flashlight. I thought that maybe a friend had woken up and had to use the bathroom before me, and somehow managed to find a working light switch there. I squatted and peered through the gap underneath the door to see who it was, and maybe scare him, if he hadn't heard me coming, that is, when I came face to face with a pair of goat legs standing there. In that moment, I was overcome with pure terror, like I had never felt, and started screaming. Next thing I know, I'm sitting in the grass outside screaming, and my friends had gathered around me, asking me what's wrong, and what I was doing screaming outside at 5 a.m. 2 hours had passed somehow, during which I blacked out, and I didn't know what happened to me, or how I changed places. That was definitely the most scared I've ever been in my life. My friends and I got out of there, and had a 30-minute walk back to town. After that experience, I've kind of avoided the town of Scaratt entirely, as it reminds me of that night.